They say some memories fade with time, but not this one. This one is burned into me, etched so deep I can feel it every time I close my eyes. That night wasn't just another job. It wasn't just another house. It was something else. Something that reached into us and pulled us apart and left us clawing at whatever pieces of ourselves were left. When I breathe, the air feels like that house. Heavy, suffocating, evil. I see the shadows creeping closer, and no matter how much time passes, I know it's still watching, waiting. I've spent years chasing demons, but this won't let us go. If I'd known what was waiting for us that night, I would have burned that place to the ground before I even stepped foot inside. We were just gonna go inside for a normal investigation, just like all the other times. Me, Dan, Sarah, Mike. We'd done this for years. Ghost spirits, ghost chasers. We were the ones that people called when things started getting weird. But nothing could have prepared us for that night. We got the call about an old Victorian mansion out in the middle of nowhere. The client said the place had a history of rituals, missing people, strange noises at night. I didn't think much of it at first. We dealt with a lot of things like that before. I figured it was just another case of bad vibes, creaky floorboards, and overactive imaginations. But I was wrong. We were all wrong. We gathered our gear like usual. I had the EMF reader. It's supposed to pick up on electromagnetic fields when a spirit is near. Dan had the spirit box, which is this device that lets you talk to the other side. It produces different ranges on different frequencies so that they can hear and interact. Sarah had the thermal camera to detect cold spots. And Mike carried the UV light for fingerprints or traces of paranormal activity. We all had crucifixes, but it wasn't enough. We talked about a plan to stay together at first, sweep the house, and gather evidence. It's the same thing that we do every time. Before we even opened our car doors and got out, my hands were already shaking. I was just pulling up to the house. We hadn't even gone in yet. When we did, it was a huge mistake. It was dark. Something in there felt like it was already watching, waiting for us. The moment we crossed the threshold, I knew we had made a mistake. Every step we took echoed, but it didn't sound right. It's just like the sound died in the walls. I turned on the EMF reader, and at first, there was nothing, just the usual low hum. But the deeper we went in the house, the more it started to spike. Just small bursts at first, but then higher and higher and faster. Dan followed behind me, fiddling with the spirit box. His hands were shaking too. He tried asking questions, the usual stuff. Is anyone there? Can you hear us? Give us a sign. At first, there was only static, but then, out of nowhere, this voice, low, growling, it said,
"Get out!"
It wasn't human. We just froze. My blood went cold. My hair stood up. I looked at Dan and I saw the fear in his eyes. We knew right then we weren't dealing with a ghost or a lost spirit. This was something evil. The EMF reader spiked again hard, and the lights in the room flickered. And Sarah was watching the thermal camera and saw something, a cold spot, and it was moving towards us. We didn't have time to think. We just followed it down the narrow hallway. The cold, it got worse. And the further we went, I could see my breath in front of me while we were walking. It was like we had entered a freezer. And at the end of the hallway, there was this old door, splintered and partially shattered. It led into the basement. I could could smell it. It reeked of damp rot, like something had died down there, and the walls were slick with moisture and something else. It was so cold it hurt to breathe, and when every step we took creaked like the wood was about to give out underneath us. And at the bottom, there was a pentagram. It was drawn on the floor with what looked like dried blood. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. And around it were strange symbols carved into the walls. I knew that this wasn't just a haunting. Something had been summoned there, and we were standing right in the middle of its lair. The EMF reader was going off the charts. The spirit box was silent, like whatever that was down there had stopped talking and started watching, started hunting. Sarah scanned the room with a thermal camera, and Mike shined the UV light all over the walls. Claw marks, dark, jagged claw marks, and fingerprints, long and thin, like something had been crawling out. We gathered the evidence, but it wasn't obvious what we were dealing with. It wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't a poltergeist. It was a demon, a real one. We had to act fast. Dan started setting up the ritual, laying out the salt, lighting the candles, and pouring holy water in the circle. The air felt like it was getting heavier by the second, like something was pushing against us. We placed the crucifixes on the ground and started chanting the exorcism. Dan recited the prayer. His voice was trembling, and before he could finish the first line, everything changed. The room started spinning, and the candles blew out. The temperature dropped even colder, and the room was plunged into total darkness. The shadows on the walls, they weren't just shadows anymore. They were moving, crawling around, crawling towards us. And then the growl came out again. But this time, it didn't want us to leave. It wanted us to stay forever. The sound echoed in our ears. It came from everywhere, deep, horrible, inhuman. And the walls started to shake, and the floor beneath us cracked. The scratching of nails dragging across the concrete. Something was in the room with us, and it was coming at us, fast. Sarah screamed, and I turned just in time to see her lifted off the ground. Something invisible, something strong had her by the throat, and she was kicking, her eyes wide with terror, her hands clawing at her neck, trying to free herself, but there was nothing there. Dan shouted the exorcism prayer, but the demon wasn't stopping. Sarah was thrown clear across the room, her body hitting the wall with a sickening Mike and I ran to her, but she was gone. Her eyes were still open. She was staring out at nothing. It didn't stop. The shadows closed in more. They twisted around Dan, choking him and dragging him to his knees. I couldn't breathe. I could hear Mike screaming, but the sound was muffled, drowned out by the growling and the scratching. This was chaos. I grabbed my crucifix and I held it out, praying and begging for it to work, but the shadows didn't stop. They swallowed us all whole. This mission was a complete and utter failure. There was no way we could win. I don't know how we got out. One moment I was suffocating in the dark, and the next I was outside, was laying in the dirt. The house was behind me, laughing like it had won. Mike was there, and Dan too, but there was no Sarah. I don't know anything else that I could have done, but we ran. We ran for our lives, and we left her behind. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry.